Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm very grateful that you're all here this evening. We are going to start off this evening by doing a lands acknowledgement to the folks who've stewarded the land here for a good long time, and be thankful to them. And then I'll introduce Julia Corbett, our moderator, and thank you all for joining us. So tonight we are thankful to serve communities in the greater Corvallis region at the heart of the Willamette Valley. We acknowledge this as the ancestral unceded lands of the Kalapuya people who were forcibly removed. We recognize the injustice of the past that shaped the largely unyielding present, and we strive to reach for a measure of justice in shaping intentional, equitable practices in the future. It is with gratitude that I thank exhibition sponsors who have made this year-long project possible for us. Dr. Dominique Bachelet and Oregon State University's College of Agriculture, Department of Biological and Ecological Engineering, and Dr. Jerry Bartholomew, who leads the OSU art+science group, who did a great part of the lecture series as well. And a special thanks to exhibition sponsors who came in early and helped support this event with the financial support that is always needed for these kinds of things. Windermere Willamette Valley Property Management team, and that's Debbie Friedlander and Sydney Stark, and we thank them very much for their support. Now I have the great pleasure of introducing Julia Corbett, who I've just recently met. She's a somewhat recent transplant to Corvallis. And excuse me, she is an emerita professor in the Department of Communication and Environmental Humanities graduate program at the University of Utah. She has a background in journalism and environmental studies, and writes both academic research and narrative nonfiction about human relationships with their living world. Her newest book is Communicating the Climate Crisis, New Directions for Facing What Lies Ahead, from Lexington Books. And her third book, Out of the Woods, Seeing Nature in the Everyday, with the University of Nevada Press, won the 2018 Reading the West Book Award in nonfiction. So those are two that you should, I will cut and paste those into the chat, and they're probably ones that you'll want to check out after this. So thank you, Julia, for moderating tonight's panel.
Thank you, Cynthia. Also, thanks to Dominique, who invited me graciously to moderate this panel. I just really like the idea of bringing together a scientist, a philosopher, and an artist to talk about the title of What Will Nature Do? We are going to be showing some screenshots of some of the artwork in that exhibit. And if you haven't had a chance to go visit it, please do so if you're in town. I think they're open till November 13th. Is that correct, Cynthia? Okay. And like I think many works of art, seeing them in person is the real experience. And I was shocked at how that was a very different experience. So I will introduce my three panelists here by one at a time, and also in a little different way of asking them to call out a piece of artwork from the exhibit that particularly resonated with them. So first we have Kate McGee. She grew up in a rural community in California's Sierra Nevada, surrounded by national forests, and worked for many years as a landscape architect in the southern Willamette Valley. She generally works in pastels, creating landscapes plein air and in the studio, but is also experimenting with new mediums. During the last 6 years, Kate and her sister wrote and illustrated 3 children's books that share their love of both marine and terrestrial environments. So Kate, what was the particular piece of artwork that really resonated for you?
First, I wanted to say, if it's okay, it will. The artists who contributed their work to this show watched a series of Zoom lectures from noted climate scientists throughout the country. Then they responded. And Nancy Hemsworth's paintings, which I chose to talk about tonight, and hopefully will appear on the screen, are three beautifully detailed understory paintings. They communicate care and concern. They are based on her careful observation of nurse logs, fallen trees that nurture baby plants and the soil as they rot. Each painting is broken into parts so we can focus on the complexity of Oregon's forest floor. Looking at them in pieces in more detail is so satisfying, but then to step back and see it, all the diversity together, is disarming. These stunning paintings tug deeply at my heart.
Okay. Thank you, Kate. Next we have Bruce Marcot. Bruce is a senior scientist and wildlife research biologist with the U.S. Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Research Station in Portland. His work predicts impacts of climate change on wildlife species of Arctic and subarctic environments to inform conservation decision-making and management. His research on forest ecosystem management has entailed living, working, and traveling with local tribes and indigenous communities around the world. Lucky guy. This year, he published a textbook titled The Science and Management of Uncertainty. He also composes classical orchestral music, writes and publishes poetry, and rides motorcycles. So Bruce, is there a particular piece that resonated with you?
Thanks, Julia. Good evening, everyone. Great to be here. Yes, the piece by Jerry Bartholomew, There Will Be Good Years, There Will Be Bad Years. And I picked that one because it does something that we scientists who are usually terrible artists like me do something wonderful, and that is scientific visualization. It gives you an understanding, a gut feel for trends, for changes, for impacts. And that's very, very much what is quite central and illustrated in this piece. It deals about climate conditions and salmon, disease of salmon inside the Klamath River. So that's one that I focused on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bruce. And next we have Rob Figueroa. He's an associate professor of environmental justice and philosophy in OSU's School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. Surviving a childhood consumed by environmental illnesses from industrial pollution, Rob juxtaposes the maritime culture of the Jersey Shore with industrial urban poverty and his Latinx diaspora of Puerto Rico. Rob is a publicly engaged and leading philosopher advocating transformative justice. He studies environmental identity and heritage, climate refugees and environmentally displaced peoples, interspecies justice, and direct action through environmental arts and multimedia to promote collective action and responsibility. So Rob, your resonating piece of artwork.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. I focused my attention on I Give, a sculpture by Michael Whiteneck from Eugene. And Michael's description of connecting climate change in a period of other social needs and responses from Black Lives Matter, and of course the current condition we all live under in COVID and a pandemic. He brings this image of raised hands pleading to be heard but not assaulted, and I think there's a number of things that are happening in this sculpture. One, the webbing that exists within the image of the feline, which is supposed to be Mother Earth, which is an interesting representation. And within that webbing are multiple levels of human and the more than human world interacting, not in surrender, but again, to an appeal to recognize those who are unheard and the ways in which our moment in history connects these kinds of social issues that include climate change and our connections and responses to non-humans in the more than human world, marginalized peoples, oppressed bodies, and the vulnerability we all have to environmental changes through COVID and other factors is a completely telling pose of environmental justice. So I want to really start off with that and thank you.
Thank you. The panelists also asked me to pick one. So Cynthia, I think you have that one queued up as well. And that is Raven Saves the People. And this was one of the ones that when I saw it in person, it just hit me in a way that didn't really seeing the JPEG version. But the notion of Raven holding, and I don't know if you can see it, probably not in this, he's holding a marble that is painted like the earth. Oops, next one. And I like the idea, and it said in Brian Egan's description of this, that the raven moves the earth a little bit away from the sun to save us. And I think what struck me about that is giving animals agency, vibrancy, animacy, all those kinds of things, and thinking of them in it with us. I'm not looking for a magic fix of ravens stepping in and doing that, but I just like the juxtaposition and the foregrounding of other creatures in the living world. So, okay. So let's go on to our next question. And if you could put kind of all four of us on the same panel, that would be, oh, there they are. In various ways, I think artists in this exhibit expressed how nature adapts and how it evolves and how it is constantly interacting and transforming in ongoing and very complex cycles. Though humans are assuredly part of nature, our species has largely resisted adapting and changing. So what do you guys believe gets in the way of our ability to accept that climate is changing profoundly and gets in the way of our making significant changes? So Bruce, why don't we start with you this time?
Okay. That's a good question, and I don't want to go dark early on here, but we do need to know how people think and how they tend to react. And first, in the area of applied climate change science, uncertainty, which is my area too, is used in risk analyses, and it's sort of helping advise decision making, risk analysis. So 3 quick points on this. First, people tend to trust what sounds certain, even if it's wrong. They trust what sounds certain, even if it's wrong. That does happen. And secondly, people tend to discount risk when it's further out into the future, even if that risk is great. This is sort of why we tend to be more concerned with potholes in the street than with global asteroid strikes. And thirdly, people tend to be confident about knowing only a little bit about something, thinking they know a lot. This is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, but terms aside, that is something that we really need to be self-aware about and mindful and conscious. So these are 3 impediments, I think, to helping us learn better and to act better.
Mm-hmm. And of course, everything that is in the future is by its very nature uncertain. But yeah, those are great points. We're not always very comfortable or good at assessing that. Rob, how about you? What gets in the way?
Yeah, hello. And so philosophers have been pretty active in worrying about what it is that separates our ethical beliefs and values from our behaviors that often contradict or go right against what we think would be the product of a good theory. What I have been suggesting is, along with many other people in the field, philosophers and others, is trying to shift the perspective and the rationality we may go by. So if we are working on individualist maneuvers to make our lives more comfortable, then that's absolutely appropriate. And if we can measure those or feel those in comparison to other things happening in the world, then we may want to tap into those feelings. And a lot of them are negative. So the first thing we might ask is, why are they negative, and why do we think they're negative? Feelings that might be anxiety, climate anxiety, that I'm too small for the big problems or something of that sort. So what we often look for is the gateways to new forms of thinking. What is made more open by thinking about our feelings in the environment. The rationality of ethics is not going to get us as far as what we really think about, what we really feel about, and what we feel connected to. There's a number of different works within the show that I think bring this to bear. I just wanted to point out that we can deny things that make us feel shameful, but we can also address things that make us feel that we've done something wrong, and we can actually repair it. And there's a lot of reparative emotions that I think we need to bring to bear within our rationality, not just the guilt and the shame, but what do we do if we want to heal someone or help someone? And let's think along those lines. Thank you.
Yeah. And I do think a lot of the discourse that we hear every day from news media, from many different scientific sources and so on, it's these two things that you just mentioned, the uncertainty, the ethics and values, the different ways of thinking and so on, the emotions, reparative emotions, those are generally not in there. It's kind of focusing on the facts, or, this is what happened, this is what is going on, but it doesn't bring that human dimension into it. So interesting. Kate, how about you? What kind of gets in the way?
One of the things that, again, Michael Whiteneck's work, I think it was called Blind Lucky. Oh, it's gone right now. But the woman with the on the ice floe and the polar bears trying to get on. And one of the things Michael wrote in his write-up was that he didn't know that he was doing the wrong thing for a long time. We didn't know. And, those of us have lived a little longer. And so now we know we can do something about it, but a little self-compassion would be okay. Anyway.
Yeah, and I know my students would talk about that it wasn't an intentional thing that we did to the earth, that it was kind of by accident, although not recognizing the enormous impact globally that we had. I mean, that was noticeable. We just didn't know the outcome of, per se, of climate change. Okay, another kind of tact here we can look at. So given that we are utterly interdependent with nature, what is our work and our responsibility as humans living within nature? So thinking from your respective disciplines, your experiences and so on, what wisdom do they provide that can better support that collective thriving that is essential beyond the individualistic thinking that Rob mentioned? Rob, you want to get us started this time?
Yes, I'm cooking around all sorts of things because I really think that Kate brought something that needs further attention, because she really hit the I think, fruit of the issue, and particularly with the piece of the Lady Luck. From a philosopher's point of view, when we see an image of that sort, we see not only the individual human against the individual polar bear, but this idea of luck fits into a long history of talking about moral luck and how we should adjudicate moral luck. And somehow my screen's not working for me, but I'll actually say what it interprets is how we get here, when we get here, and why we get here at the very time that we did is, a series of events, causes and effects. But once we are here, we have advantages and disadvantages that all compound to make things better or worse. And ultimately, we find ourselves within an ongoing moral discourse about what is better or worse. And the moral luck of being in the right place at the right time, being privileged, as it were, that you get to make better decisions about your life, freer decisions, etc., versus the moral luck of someone who might be, say, right next to you, but doesn't experience any of that process in life, and find is differentiated in worlds. At the very same time in history, when we can do all sorts of things like feed the world, and we can do all sorts of things with technology that can be shared, we realize there's a moral luck to who is advantaged, who's disadvantaged, and then what kind of moral decisions that we make. That idea of Lady Luck turning away is such a great image of that moral luck compound. So I think the way to think about this is, okay, given my moral, and that's a cartooning image of what we may actually be lampooning to the universe, but on the other hand, it may actually be an insight to the other way we would play our moral luck, which is to expand those advantages and make those privileges and make those practicalities real. And I think that this has to happen really at the grassroots level with people who who know what is best for them and their environment. But collectively, it means everyone can be improving the conditions of climate change if they see that all these small practical opportunities that are being taken and small measures from the ground to the atmosphere really are collective allies that have to work on the same time frame that climate change is going to be working. And we are actually at the beginning of our opportunity to understand where we are with regard to climate and to sustain through this with the climate, and again with it, because it's part of how we understand our vulnerability in our moral luck. So I really want to press upon not the platitudes of practical awareness, but really understanding that what we're doing now does have a longevity to the benefits that we may be able to pass on, not just the negative consequences of what we pass on. Thanks.
Good point.
You didn't go dark there at all, Rob. You went the opposite direction, so that's good. So I saw both Kate and Bruce kind of smiling at various things that you said. Do you want to enter in here?
Go ahead, Bruce.
Okay, I was going to say, go ahead, Kate. That's fine. Yeah, the art piece, Lady Luck Turns a Blind Eye on Global Warming by Michael Whiteneck. That really hits home for me because I have studied polar bears in the Arctic Ocean, flying out on copters onto sea ice and darting them and taking samples and so on. What I did up there to foster a better understanding, talk about, how do you go from individual to sort of corporate responsibility, which to me means an ability to respond, take something on positive, what I did up there with colleagues was to spend time with the Russian Yupiks, the elders, in a circle of elder on the island of St. Lawrence in the middle of the Bering Sea, in the village of Savunga. And there we spent several days just going through their knowledge, their understanding, their history. And I've done that with Garo Hills tribe up in Northeast India. I've done it with the Udige of the Russian Far East and quite a few other spots around the globe. And just getting them to, first of all, trust that I'm not going to adversely accommodate their knowledge into something else that isn't going to help. It's to understand what they have found and known. So I think that's a very, very big step. So polar bears, walruses too, I have studied up there and spent time with the Inupiats, and it's really helped to open my eyes and understanding. And I use their information sort of to truth out these statistical scientific models that I have built to help to project what's the probability of the impact of climate shift and change on some of these rare forms of life. So I deal with sort of probabilities, but I use their information, their knowledge to really strengthen my own set of understanding in my scientific work and my tools. So thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Okay.
Well, when Rob said all the small things people do, you know, the things we're all trying to do individually, if there was some way to measure how they add up, to report back, you know, how things are improving. And, you know, there's more dolphins in Cambodia in Mekong River, or, you know, the things that happen with the small changes we're making locally. You know, that would give people more hope. There'd be more, you know, it seems like it would help the ball roll faster. So I like that concept.
Well, and that does contribute greatly then to that collective thriving.
Right.
So, yeah. Throughout the various art pieces, I at least experienced an emotional tension, whereas some of them were celebrating and finding a lot of hope in nature's ability to change and adapt and so on. But there was also some grieving for the beings who are suffering and lost or in danger, et cetera. And all of us, whether we recognize it or not, have deep emotions, and probably we all have fears, some fears at least, about climate change. And that includes climate scientists, artists, kids, everyone. Psychologists also recognize that facing such emotions must precede and or accompany action, that they're a part of that piece and that puzzle and so on. So how do you guys negotiate your emotions about climate change in your work and also in your personal life? Who wants to get us going?
Well, I'll go, Rob.
Well, okay, I'll jump in. I have an opportunity to work in areas where people are writing and really thinking about conditions of climate anxiety, things of guilt and shame, and also the ways in which we have many existing tools that can be transformed to the moment we're in. Most people who feel anxiety have to look towards certain social networks, or they have someone who can advise them on the kind of concerns that are most threatening or not. But outside of there, things like guilt, shame, even despair have a lot of long existing, essentially from the advent of civilization, things like community, religion, various activities that bring the society together. And a lot of these things are there invested for longevity again, that we actually do have the tools that can be transformed for climate anxiety and climate affects. And I want to, again, really press us on being able to feel what we do as a gateway, as a moral gateway to what we want to achieve, rather than as something that leads us paralyzed to respond. And to dig deeper in that feeling of incapacity and inability, um, that's where often we need to dig deeper into what we think it means to be human, what we think it means to be the person we wanted to be or wish to be. And that's it's a very singular, in-depth reflection on what do I feel, and can I be something that is on the future of the planet or the people that I care about. And I really think that's that depth of knowing that something is making a difference, even if it is to a collective end, which we may be witnessing, and we may have been chosen, in our time and in the randomness of it, to be the witnesses of our existence. And that's what we all will be ultimately. Thank you.
Well, art certainly has a place in that, Bruce. I mean, Robert, sorry, Rob. Because it is scary to take a look at climate change and to spend time hearing about it. It's scary. But so to deal with it, I had to adapt. And my adaptation was focusing on what was near to me that I had agency over. And for me, that's making art, and participating in a show like this is a piece of that. I can tell about the changes. It gives me a role to play in our adaptation together. So, I see where you're coming from there. It helped me a lot.
And I imagine that the books she wrote, the kids' books, was also a way to deal with some of those, emotions.
Yeah, it's really powerful to think of parents holding their children and learning about the natural environment. It's just with their mush in the morning. It's really great.
Yep.
Some of the cultures that I deal with, there is great trepidation that comes from uncertainty. What's going to happen? Catastrophic fires, flooding. What's going to happen next year, in 5 years, to my kids? From a scientific end, I don't want to go down that path. I want to see advantages of scientific uncertainty, because if you think of it correctly, it helps you avoid being closed-minded, that we know it all, for one thing. It should engender curiosity about what else to think about that we hadn't. Uncertainty shouldn't be viewed as kind of a failure of understanding. It should help to prompt re-asking things in kind of a new slant, seeking a new angle, perspective, consider relationships not thought of. And basically it's sort of to prompt oneself to help to question our own thoughts and beliefs, which can take courage. That can take courage. But just as certainty can help to prompt strong beliefs in being self-assured, uncertainty, I think, should further prompt a boldness to sort of re-examine it and to ask ourselves what we think we know, or better, to sort of expand the context of that sort of information-based knowledge that we do have, to see sort of the way things tend to link up. I use a lot of sort of network theory and how things cause other things, whether it's sea ice causing shifts of seal prey for polar bears and so on. So thinking of connections in a very new way, given uncertainty, is something that has really helped my science anyhow.
When I would teach a class communicating climate change to students, one of the things they said helped them the most emotionally was talking about it. And there was even a former EH graduate student who started this group that some of you may have heard of. It's based in Salt Lake City, called Good Grief. And it's a climate grief kind of support group. And it now, I think, has chapters in some other places. But just saying, yeah, things are bad and blah, blah, blah. And, what are we going to do? But just expressing it, at least for the young folks, and knowing that it was okay to be worried, but just don't stop there, and do something with it. So in 2021, I read this a couple of weeks ago. There was a huge spike, not just in people Googling things about COVID, but a huge spike in people who Googled, what can I do about climate change? And on a purely individual level, yes, climate change can be paralyzing. So I often wondered, okay, what did those people find when they Googled that? Did they find, ways to get to this collective action and so on that we've been talking about? And when individuals, I think, Rob, you were talking about individuality before, when individuals think of themselves as embedded in all sorts of social networks, their power and their agency to make a difference is so much greater. Because if you're, and we were talking earlier today, Dominique had an example of a young kid who didn't just reduce his own food waste, he got the whole city to do that. And that's such a huge leap up in terms of agency power to actually do something that kind of matches the magnitude of the problem. And I liked how many of the artists recognized, as another place to get to this, what can we do, the need to question our assumptions and our practices and work hard to transform them. So on this broader plane, what do you believe is needed to help transform human practices and, in a big way or small way, our relationship with the living world? So how can we get to that questioning assumptions, practices, transform them, et cetera, kind of the what do we do next kind of stage?
I'll jump in if you don't
Go for it.
want to pick any of us to solve the problem. So I'm going to solve this problem because I'm a philosopher.
I had a roommate who was a philosophy.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So a few things that have resonated with me. One of them, from speaking, as Bruce and others have discussed, speaking to many different people from different backgrounds and different struggles around the world. One context is to be able to listen before trying to assist with the opportunities that we do have. We know here, maybe in Corvallis or in other places, may feel that we are privileged and we can make that change, but listening to who we are making the change or making the offer for, and asking that kind of permission from their position is going to matter more to being a human being than what nature will ultimately do. And that hopefully will translate into how we will actually live with nature. So the listening aspect is listening to others, but also listening to what obviously our more than human others and relations are conveying to us. And when I mean listen, I don't mean try to gain greater knowledge. I mean actually to gain greater respect. So we have a tendency to try to know more in order to respect someone deeper or better, get to know them, to respect them. But we need to start not just in philosophy, but in our sciences and in our practices and technologies, and art, I think, is expressive of this. A respect before a knowledge, no presumption on the knowledge. The respect is to listen. And I think the other types of lessons that really do work on the human potential side, listening recently to Jane Goodall speaking about the power of human intellect as opposed to human intelligence, whereas human intelligence is really not comparative probably to the intelligence of all the other creatures in the world. Intelligence is what it means to do your thing. But the intellect that we have, the amazing things that the human intellect has been capable of, what kinds of horizons it envisions in all of its activities, how to take that, not just by technological means, but that intellect forward and fuse that to the goals we want with being allies to other ecosystems and other ecologies that we're a part of. So those two things, again, they're feely things and thinking things, because you won't appreciate the action and the activity that you do by having someone else prescribe it. You will commit to it by coming to it by your own means. And these are just avenues for opening up to what means you have.
Thank you. I'll jump in here with a comment for you guys because it fits here. One thing that I found both in community groups and with students is that when people think about a future climate change world, they just know it's going to be bad. And they really have trouble imagining a future world that they want to live in. And I've seen other quotes and whatnot that a lot of how we're stuck where we're stuck is due to a profound lack of imagination. Yeah. And really thinking about, okay, what can I let go of, but what do I really want in that future world? And reimagining rather than, as you said, having it prescribed for you and getting involved at your community level or whatever of, okay, this is what I want my future world to be like. And so I had my students do a story writing exercise about that. And they say it helps to imagine, okay, gosh, the air pollution that Salt Lake City now has year round would be better. Things could be better and not worse, because I think people are kind of fearful and stuck in that, thinking that, oh, it's going to be bad, and they don't keep going. So, Kate, Bruce?
Well, so yeah, trying to foster imagination takes different thinking from outside. I mentor young scientists, and I think doing some kind of a mentoring is extremely important for those of us who are older and more established, and hopefully I'm not the establishment, but still mentoring others. I've taken grade school classes out into the field to have them help me do sampling of invertebrates and plants and that sort of thing. And as we're out there, we talk about the future, we talk about the importance of understanding things, science. So being able to mentor, I think, would play a very, very important step in trying to get at what you're after, Julia.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay.
Well, again, this is just me talking, but just knowing other things that are happening due to climate change that aren't so scary. When they tell you about the whales in the waters off of Spain, it's kind of exciting. And it made me start to think about, as you say, more imaginatively about what this will be like. The trees up in the tundra, or Dominique mentioned the other day that, up there in the boreal forest, underneath those layers, it's a tropical geology. I get if that's in the geologic layers, you can see that it was a different kind of environment early on. So this is about change, and it doesn't need to be horrible. And the exercise of what will nature do really made me have to think about that in a different light instead of doom and gloom. And it was really healthy, I think, this whole project.
Okay. I just realized we had talked earlier about showing a couple pieces of art at the end, and maybe a good one to end on here would be the Pando one, Cynthia, which is that collective thriving for sure. And this is, somebody else give the little sound bite to it. Somebody explain Pando.
Well, this was one of the ones that I had thought of, and I didn't want to let us leave without it. There's a tremendous amount of focus. There's a tremendous amount of foreground and a tremendous amount of background that may appear blurry because of the extent of the horizon. We have here one of the great representations of an organism interconnected over broad stretches of geography and broad stretches of time. And I think with many of our other ideas of resilience that have been expressed through multiple artworks that I've listed, and I'm sorry for the artists for not being able to name all of them through. This one is, along with others that carry a theme of this interconnectedness, and not to be an interconnected one whole, but to be an interconnected universe of differences that actually make up this place. And this place is maybe an organism, and it may be the earth, and it may be humanity, and it may be all of our interactions over time. But it is not just simply a piece of dirt. It is a place over time that we represent. And I think that placing ourselves in that way, and this representation has been tremendous, also in demonstrating that there are things that we will be responsible not to share for the sake of preserving knowledge or even identity or even other parts of nature. And I think that that's part of what our obligation is.
Hester put the info up there in the exhibit. When you go see it, this thing is huge, which makes the impact even more so. It's 60 by 28, and the artist was Mary McDermott, oil on canvas. And I believe it's in the Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. And it's supposed to be the biggest living organism because they're calling it this one, like you said, thing. Okay, I wanted to make sure that we didn't talk the whole time and that we left plenty of time for you guys to ask of any of the panelists questions, have them talk a little bit more about anything, and so on. So, oh, sorry, 60 by 48, not 28. Okay, the size of that painting. So any questions? You can do the little raise your hand question, or you can write an icon, or write it in a chat, any of that. And this is when we need to know there really are people out there.
Mary is actually online, and she could say something about her piece.
Sure. Maybe she doesn't want to.
I will. I don't know what you'd like to hear about it. I think it's all in the book that Dominique put out. So that's really all I can say is thank you for, honoring my piece.
Did you go over there to see the Pando?
Yes, I did.
Cool.
Very cool.
I love your background, Dominique. Amy,
That's one of the pieces, isn't it?
yeah.
It is. It is.
It is from Amy Manion from Pittsburgh.
Yes.
Really great.
So there
Ron?
is another question in the chat.
Donna, there's a question.
So, and
That's me.
oh wait, hold on. I need to turn up my volume, I think. You need to turn down your volume. Okay, so I was wondering, and this was maybe in particular to something that Bruce had said, is it harder for a scholar or professor or scientist to see the positive aspects than it is for just a lay person to, because I see I see several different people coming from the perspective of like seeing hope or not seeing hope. And I think this study was, this panel was a great idea because I think sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's difficult for me to see the hope that I have seen is, well, people will just die and the earth will live, and that will be the hope that happens. But I'm hearing more from the panel of like a different kind of hope, a hope that humans can make changes and humans can change their perspective, and maybe even just having hope in itself will help to make the changes that need to be made that could like turn things in a different direction. So is there a difference in who is having the hope, or is it just you know, we all have to kind of work together to make it happen?
Hey, Dawn, as a scientist, I really take what you just said to heart, because yeah, I kind of see that in some of the science about publications which rather incessantly point out adverse impacts of human activities, whether it's CO2 or plastics or whatever. Plastics, George Carlin quipped that it is the purpose of people on Earth to make plastic for the Earth. No, let's not go there. But truly, finding that sort of optimism is difficult for some scientists. The way again, I want to spin and look at uncertainty is to have to be a positive force, to force us to rethink things, you know, to really cause us to back up and ask, okay, what was I not considering? What connections could I be thinking about now? And that's where the Pando aspen image really comes in, because I study what I call key ecological functions of organisms, everything from fungi to owls, and how everything really is, it sounds almost Zen-like, everything really is interacting out there. And to really understand that it's not just separate forests, separate people, separate animals, but everything truly does influence everything else. So that's kind of the optimism that I want to help to foster, you know, through taking kids out into the woods and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure if I answered anything here, but
No, that's great.
Okay.
So there's a question from Jerry and a question from Hester, or a hand raise. So either of you can jump in.
One of the things that we heard from artists was this optimism requirement, so to speak, for the show. And when Dominique and Jay and I were looking at work that was submitted, we quite often said, yeah, this is too doom and gloom. But I wanted to have a comment maybe from Kate, who said being part of this show helped. Were you initially saying, you know, I cannot deal with this, we're gonna die and everybody is gonna die, which is true, but so could you comment on that? Did you go from doom gloom to their little sparks of hope, or?
It gave me a much broader picture and also a more detailed picture as I looked into it. And because you put on the show, it gave me a reason to move through that. And you set it up that I had to be hopeful. And I am more hopeful because, for one thing, here we all are. There's quite a few of us here connecting tonight. I'm thrilled at how many people tuned in. I just, and that gives me hope.
I would add a little piece to that is climate scientist herself and very good climate communicator gets asked a lot about hope. And she said, hope doesn't just arrive. Hope comes through action. And so I kind of wondered if Bruce's comment about, scientists being out there interacting and being engaged with it, if part of that is their action and therefore their hope, is that they're getting this deeper understanding for how things are working out there. And even for an artist or any writer or whatever, I think when you are doing something, it does change that kind of emotional makeup. And oftentimes that action is engaged with other people. And I really do think getting out of your own social isolation and paralysis and being with other people is a key part of that hope as well. And is there still a hand up from Jerry?
Yeah. I realize we all look at climate change through a very human-focused, anthropocentric lens because, we're concerned about how it affects us. And, we're babies on this planet compared to most of the species that are extant right now. And I think it kind of gives me hope. I work with salmon and, they've been through climate change and they've been around a long time. And I do see problems arising. A lot of what we study is what's going to happen, with changing climate and salmon populations and their distribution. But part of me has no doubt that they'll survive. It will be different, but I think they will survive. That there will be winners and losers. There always are, and we've seen a lot of losers. And a lot of species have gone extinct, not only from climate change, but from a lot of other human practices. I think, though, I read a really fun article this morning from evolutionary scientists reimagining or imagining what some of the species in the future might be that are adapting to climate change. And it was really kind of fun for me to think so far outside the box, to pigeons that are the size of ostriches that can, that are adapted to deal with things. But, I think we have to step back from looking at how it affects us to how it affects everything else.
Jerry, did that article include futuring of people? Are we going to suddenly grow gills with filters to filter out?
They didn't talk about people, and I wish they had. It was in Vox, a National Geographic article, but
thank you.
Fun.
I didn't see any other hand raises. Any other comments, questions?
I want to echo what I've learned in philosophy back when people are having types of existential crisis in earlier centuries like the 19th and 20th century. I know we don't have those anymore. And much of it was always negative from certain perspectives, but I always felt it was somehow empowering. We we're responsible for the choices we make. No one else is really responsible. There are background conditions that put us in situations, but we make choices. And there's a lot of ways in which we are inauthentic about how we own those choices. There's a lot of ways in which we, psychologically are in denial. We live kind of false lives. And the goal was really to take better responsibility and agency over the very short time that you get to be human and that humans get to be existing. The very short time, in what we can see as the larger part. And otherwise is to give into a certain level of absurdity that we're just spinning ourselves, that is getting caught in that undertow of absurdity when we could be making choices. We could be doing something. And I think that this is, a larger part here, which is a point where we need to be existential about where we are in this process with other Earth processes, and responsibility just being authentic and having the courage to be who we are. There's no humans who haven't made grand mistakes. We are the humans who inherited a modern industrial society that embedded grand mistakes. And we have every choice in the world, as strange as it seems, to do so in the face of the absurdity that we may not make any difference except that we made a choice. And I think that that's very baseline. But in the face that nature will continue in, for as many, I think, the sun ends in another billion years, so we can kind of hang out until then. I'm keeping it on my calendar, but nature will do that, and it will do that for, we're connected to it, and we will dispose as well. But what does it mean to be our choices? What does it mean to be responsible? That's a human dignity that we have an opportunity to enjoy. And I'll leave that to my, philosophical, folks in the audience.
Well, and it does address a question in chat from that the panelists share seeds of hope, or the hope we share with those for whom hope is more difficult to see. And so I think yours is a good start in that direction, that it is a choice. And in that sense, then we are not a victim just waiting for the apocalypse to ride through, that there are choices that we can make. I guess for me, I'll start off and then ask the others. I have a lot of hope in the new engagement of younger generations who are seeing that this is the world they are inheriting and they have to step up. I hope that gets renewed after, can I say that, the pandemic, and that they get back out there and demanding it. Because I studied a lot in graduate school of sociology and social change and whatnot. And to produce significant social change, you often have to go through a period of cultural trauma. And I think in many ways we're kind of there. And what the cultural trauma then has to result in are changing the institutions, the structures, et cetera, that are not working. And we see this, I think, in a small initial way, just because it's in our faces and in our basements, how infrastructure is failing. And it was built for a climate that no longer exists. But I see hope in young people. And sadly, the more wicked that the climate results get, it is harder and harder and harder throughout the entire world to separate climate as out there and having nothing to do with me. So even the fact that more and more people have lived through and have it part of their personal experience and history, it's harder and harder to ignore. So it's a matter of, like Rob said, getting them then to making that moral choice and starting to act and getting more hopeful. Sometimes I think those two go together. The hope just doesn't arrive. Yeah. So Kate, Bruce, what are seeds of hope that you have, or what do you do with those for whom hope is more hard to see?
Kate, please.
It's still hard for me to see. It's hard. I've tried to share with my kids how to think about it, to, just not look out there so far, and to just be close and with your friends and the things that really count. And live, light on the land, do the things you can do and do them now. But they're still overwrought, and I wish I could involve them in something beyond themselves that they could see the result from. I think that would help a lot.
How old are they, Kate?
They're in their mid-30s.
Okay.
Well,
Okay,
also, I think there are some really good empirical stories and evidence of hope. And sometimes we do have to go through some difficult periods to get there. I did some of the very early field studies on a critter called the northern spotted owl. And a lot of the old growth ecosystem species out there. And back in the 80s and early 90s, we had the owl wars, the old growth wars. It was owls versus jobs. And it was dire. And I went back to DC several times and spoke with the chief of the Forest Service and panels. And it was a very difficult time. What it led to was President Clinton convening a scientific panel, a panel of scientists and decision makers and managers in Portland, that led to the Forest Ecosystem Management Assessment Team that I was on. I was one of the chief ecologists on that. And we looked at old growth and came up with what's called the Northwest Forest Plan. Maybe some of you have heard of this, that establishes late successional reserves, old growth islands almost out there now in the sea of burned areas and sea of second growth forests and all, which still play a critical ecosystem role. So these old growth islands were able to conserve a vast amount of what was then existing, which was only like 5% of the aboriginal amount of old growth, into these late successional reserves. And we found a very good balance point. So the Northwest Forest Plan with these old growth areas have been in stay and in play now for 25 years. This is one empirical story of hope that I see. So there are some out there, from the standpoint of scientists having worked closely with policymakers. This can happen. So I see that also quite positive for hope inside of the climate change area too.
Thank you, Bruce. Well, maybe hope is a good aspiration to end on here. I did want to allow Dominique to kind of plug her January event, which she's thinking of as kind of a taking off point from the What Would Nature Do part. But first, I just want to thank all of you for coming and listening and being here. And of course, to my wonderful panelists for their insights as well. So Dominique, do you want to say something?
Yes. So the next show is called Imagine the Future, and it will take place at the Philomath Museum. So the Benton County Museum in Philomath. And the show will be January 28th to March 5th, 2022. And the call to artists is all the artists have to submit by November 19th. And so I am hoping that we're going to have some school teachers who will actually ask their students to put together postcards from the future. There's a colleague of mine who is doing that, and it's really interesting to see what the young people think. And that's what this show was about, is to give hope that, you know, the future is not going to be all dark. And I was going to ask Jillian, who has asked her students in Climate Change 101 at OSU to actually come see the show and give some comments to tell us how the students reacted to them. And did they think, like, at the very beginning, when I contacted my colleagues who were scientists to talk about the positive aspect of climate change, I heard a lot of people saying, well, don't be disingenuous. You know, climate change will have dire consequences. It's like, yeah, there will be problems, but there will also be opportunities. So what did your students say, Jillian?
Oh, unfortunately, the deadline has not been yet. So hopefully they're here listening to all of this hope, because they need it. I don't talk too much about hope in our class.
Right.
But one thing that I have found personally very hopeful is in the face of this whole, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change 2018 report saying we have to reach 45% of our 2010 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050, that people get just freaked out by those, even me, like, wow, that's like, so we have to change everything so quickly. And I was really inspired by a new movie that came out called Breaking Boundaries, that has David Attenborough and Johan Rockström. And that Johan Rockström points out in that movie, they have a lot of hope in there. And he points out that if we that any human or family or a community can reduce their emissions by 6 to 7% per year. And it turns out that if you reduce your emissions by 6 to 7% per year, every year for a decade, you have halved your emissions. And so if we half our emissions for 3 decades, in a row, we will be at net zero. And thinking of the numbers in that way is much more manageable. And so I leave that as another point of hope, in addition to all the wonderful ones that we got to hear. But as students turn their reports in, I will definitely forward them to you.
Great. Thank you, Jillian.
Thank you. Okay.
Julia, all yours.
No, I already said my little goodbye and thanked my panelists and all that. So I'm good. So
Thank you, Julia.
Okay.
Okay, well then I'll thank everybody, and to Jen, who actually was looking for pearls of wisdom about seeds of hope. There's a whole series of TED Talks that will be released for COP26 next week, starting Monday, and it's about all green opportunities, green initiatives around the world. There's a lot of things out there. Try to check TED Talks starting Monday. All the people who have actually worked on solutions will be talking about it and wondering why they don't get more incentives from government. So a lot of people are working on this. Hope should be there, because if the governments don't make the right decisions locally, people will. So good night.